This is the Joseph Ryder Lewis Jr. Civil War Park. Joseph Ryder Lewis was a Carolina Beach resident, World War II veteran, employee of the Corps of Engineers, and before his passing, about 12 years ago now, he donated approximately 10 acres of land to the town of Carolina Beach with the stipulation that it be built into a Civil War park. And then he sadly passed away, but his family was determined to open this park with the city's support. And so the Federal Point Historic Preservation Society, which is headquartered in the old gazebo at the Blockade Runner Museum, where I was the last curator back in the late 70s. We kind of took up the project. It took us 8 years to work through the bureaucratic red tape and finally get this park opened. And then just before it opened, Carolina Beach got squirrely about calling it a Civil War park because of the political environment. And so the Lewis family was like, okay, fine, then we get the land back. And that changed everything. So it opened up 2 years ago on February the 11th, which just happened to be the anniversary of the Battle of Sugar Loaf, between U.S. colored troops and Robert F. Hoke's brigade, which had been sent here in late 1864 to support Fort Fisher. I don't know how much y'all know, but Wilmington, of course, was the South's principal seaport after Charleston was put under siege and New Orleans fell in 1862. More blockade runners smuggled supplies in from Europe into Wilmington than all other southern seaports. And Wilmington became increasingly important as other southern seaports were effectively blockaded, or like Savannah and New Orleans fell into Union hands. By 1863, Robert E. Lee said that Wilmington must be defended at all hazards because of the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad. So when blockade runners that smuggled supplies from Europe by way of the Bermudas and Nassau entered the Cape Fear River, went up to Wilmington, unloaded their supplies, would trade, of course, military supplies for cotton, so basically guns for cotton. Then the supplies were put on railroads to be sent to the needy, either those on the home front or, more importantly, as the war progressed, the battlefront in Virginia, where General Robert E. Lee was engaged in a war of attrition and stalemate for possession of Petersburg against U.S. Grant's forces. So from the summer of 1864, really the late spring of 1864, until the spring of 1865, they were locked on each other's jaws like two giant fighting dogs. And nothing could break the stalemate. And Lee's army was being supplied by the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, which ran from Wilmington to Goldsboro to Weldon, where it connected with the Petersburg and Weldon. So that was the major supply route for Robert E. Lee's army. And by late 1864, he said, if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. So the message was clear that the survival of the Army of Northern Virginia depended upon the survival of Wilmington as a blockade running seaport. And the survival of the Confederacy depended upon the survival of the Army of Northern Virginia. So that's why I argue that Wilmington was not just the South's main seaport, but also its most important city. You could have moved the seat of government from Richmond to Lincolnton, to Robert F. Hoke's hometown. As the Confederate government, as you know, moved from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond in May of 1861. But Wilmington had to remain in safe hands. And so to assure that would occur, in December of '64, Robert E. Lee detached one of his best division, Robert F. Hoke's divisions, 4 brigades, more than 6,400 troops, to come to Wilmington to support the garrisons at the forks at the mouth of the Cape Fear River. And the main one, of course, was Fort Fisher that guarded New Inlet, the northern entryway into the Cape Fear River. Because Federal forces figured if they could capture Fort Fisher, they, in effect, have killed two birds with one stone. No Wilmington-bound blockade runner could have gotten further upriver had they entered through Old Inlet at the mouth of the river, coming out of Nassau, say, and entered Old Inlet, which is the main channel today. They could not have gotten further upriver than New Inlet if Federal forces held that ground. And there was a political reason for going after Fort Fisher too. That was the largest, strongest Confederate seacoast fortification. It was considered the strongest fort really in all of North America at the time. And if Federal forces could capture it, that'd be a feather in the Navy Department's cap and pad the '66 budget. So there was a good political reason for going after Fort Fisher too. And as y'all know, there would be two attacks against Fort Fisher, which guarded, if you turn your map to where it says engagement of Sugar Loaf, February 11th, '64, and look to the bottom and you see Fort Fisher. We are about 4 miles north of Fort Fisher. And Fort Fisher guarded New Inlet, the northern entryway into the Cape Fear River. So, Federal forces, you know, attacked Fort Fisher twice before they finally captured it. Once at Christmas 1864, in what turned out to be the largest naval bombardment of the Civil War. But the fort held its own because of poor cooperation between the Naval Task Force Commander, Admiral David Dixon Porter, and the commander of the Expeditionary Force, the Army's Expeditionary Force, Benjamin F. Butler. So the mission failed. They returned 2.5 weeks later to renew the attack in what turned out to be the largest American amphibious operation until D-Day World War II. And that's in our backyard. And so after Federal forces captured Fort Fisher and the harbor was effectively closed to blockade running, what purpose did Wilmington serve? Why should Federal forces go after Wilmington, and why should Confederate forces defend it? The works here in the park and the works that we're going to walk on today were built as auxiliary works to support Fort Fisher. In October of 1864, the Cape Fear Department Commander, William Whiting, came on steamer down to Fort Fisher. He and Colonel William Lamb, the fort's commander, got on horseback and rode up the peninsula, Federal Point Peninsula, or what Southerners called Confederate Point in those days. And General Whiting pointed out exactly where Federal forces would come ashore if they attacked Fort Fisher, which would be out on the beach and on what today would be Carolina Beach's north end. You got that slither of sand where troops could land. You've got water separating them from the mainland, and they could land, they believe, relatively unmolested. So Whiting pointed out, this is where we're going to build a long line of works, all the way from the ocean to the river, more than a mile, so that we've got troops in place. When Federal forces come ashore, we can stop them. Think of the German strategy during the Normandy invasion. You stop them from coming onto the beach. And Whiting said, if Federal forces come ashore, establish a beachhead, the fall of Fort Fisher is but a matter of time, and then Wilmington. And so that's why these works were built, and that's why they would be, there would be troops here during what became known as the Wilmington Campaign. All right, anybody have any questions?
Did the Union Army have entrenchments as well?
They did. In the second attack, 9,600 troops would come ashore, including U.S. colored troops. About 1/3 of the Expeditionary Force comprised U.S. colored troops, as they were officially designated in those days. They established a beachhead, and they came ashore, by the way, relatively unmolested. The government made the big mistake of assigning General Braxton Bragg to command the forces in the Department of North Carolina, which included the Department of the Cape Fear. And you all know Braxton Bragg. He was the most hated Confederate general officer, even among his own colleagues or comrades. His most recent biographer, Earl Hess, titled his book, Braxton Bragg, the Confederacy's most hated general. So imagine that legacy. But when Jefferson Davis made the decision to send Bragg to Wilmington to make sure it remained in safe hands, the Virginia media got wind of it, and newspaper headlines read, Braxton Bragg has been ordered to Wilmington. Goodbye, Wilmington. So Southerners had very little faith in Braxton Bragg, and he would prove to be, live up to his reputation as being not a fighting general. Had Beauregard been sent here from Charleston, and y'all know that Charleston underwent the longest siege of the Civil War, 587 days, and did not fall. So send P.G.T. Beauregard up to Wilmington. He and Whiting were good friends. They worked well together. How about D.H. Hill? But Jefferson Davis decided on Braxton Bragg, and it was a huge mistake. A very questionable, controversial decision, and we could stand here all day and just talk about why Davis sent Bragg to protect Wilmington. But one smart thing that he did was to, again, send Robert F. Hoke's division of 6,400 troops. But it would be up to Braxton Bragg as to how they were going to be deployed. Do you send one brigade, two brigades to Fort Fisher to bolster the garrison, which was only about 2,300 men, who are going to be fighting against 9,600 members of the Expeditionary Force, plus 58 warships with about 630 cannons that are bombarding the fort relentlessly for 2.5 days. So that'd be like withstanding a B-52 strike for a couple of days before you had to come out and fight against the Expeditionary Force. So of course you want reinforcements. And here's Braxton Bragg with Hoke's division 4 miles to the north, 6,400 troops deployed along this line, and Bragg just sits on them. He does not use them to reinforce the fort. And of course, Fort Fisher falls on the night of January the 15th, 1864. But then federal forces are determined to capture Wilmington. In the first attack against Fort Fisher, it is meant to capture the fort and close the harbor to blockade running. But the second attack, the objective has changed. Now they want to capture Wilmington, with Fort Fisher being the launching pad for that movement. And this was all in support of General William Sherman's proposed northern expedition, or what we call the Carolinas Campaign, marching through the Carolinas toward Virginia. After capturing Atlanta in early September of '64, and then marching beginning in November the entire breadth of the state of Georgia, destroying everything in his path like an army of army ants, he captured Savannah on December the 21st, at about the same time that the first attack on Fort Fisher would begin. He presented the city to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. Grant, for his part, is now glad to see Sherman safe on the seacoast, and he wants to transfer his 60,000-man legion from Savannah to southeastern Virginia to reinforce his army for one massive push against Robert E. Lee's strongly entrenched army, which he's been able to break the deadlock for months now. But Sherman, having successfully marched to the sea, proposes to do the same thing in the Carolinas. He'll march into South Carolina, destroy railroads, depots, caches of supplies, infrastructure, plantations, whatever, anything in his path. And once he gets to North Carolina, his objective would be Goldsboro. Because from Goldsboro, he can go south to attack Wilmington. He can go west to the state capital at Raleigh, or What he would like to do is go straight up the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad to strike the underbelly of Lee's army. And with Grant pressing Lee from the east and Sherman attacking him from the south, they would drive him out of his entrenchments into open ground, and then a pincer movement, they strike and defeat Lee, and the war finally will come to a close after 4 bloody long years. So Grant later wrote, "I would have entrusted that movement to no other general officer but William T. Sherman." So he authorizes the attack, what Grant termed the Northern Expedition, and to assure its success, he wants to provide Sherman a haven on the seacoast where he can retreat if he got into trouble, because no one knew what kind of opposition Sherman would face when he got into the Carolinas. Already he's got William Hardee's army that he has to contend with, but suppose Lee detaches more divisions to attack Sherman. So provide a haven on the seacoast where Sherman can retreat, or from where he could be reinforced and resupplied. Roughly halfway between Petersburg and Wilmington. And where would that be? Wilmington. 3 railroads, Cape Fear River, navigable all the way to Fayetteville. So you've got lines of communication once Sherman could get to North Carolina. Or he could retreat to Wilmington and be protected by the Navy that would be attacking Fort Fisher. So that was the situation. And that's why Fort Fisher was attacked that second time. And now federal forces want to capture Wilmington. And that's where these lines come into play. So let's walk into the park. I know this is only supposed to be a 2-hour tour, a 2-hour tour.
3-hour tour.
3-hour tour. We can make it a 3-hour tour, but I'll try to keep it in the 2-hour range, okay? Nancy says, "You're always lecturing. Just give them the short version."
I get stiff standing still. My problem.
I know y'all have varying degrees of knowledge about Wilmington, the Cape Fear during the Civil War, and maybe varying degrees of geography. But we are on a peninsula that was in the Civil War called Federal Point Peninsula, that again, Southerners renamed Confederate Point Peninsula for those 4 years. And it's pie-shaped. It tapers to an end at New Inlet, which was formed by a hurricane in 1761. And while the Corps of Engineers in the 1850s recommended closing New Inlet, it was not done until after political reconstruction in the late 1870s. And that worked out well for the Confederate blockade runners because it gave them a choice of entry and exit at Wilmington Harbor. You had Old Inlet, the main channel to the south, 6 miles to the northeast. You've got New Inlet, separated by Bald Head Island and Frying Pan Shoals that stretch 18 miles southeasterly into the Atlantic Ocean. It's just ideal for blockade runners because it gave them, again, that choice of entry and exit to Wilmington Harbor. Generally, blockade runners that came out of Nassau would enter through Old Inlet. Those that came out of Bermuda would enter through New Inlet. And New Inlet became the most popular entryway for the blockade runners. And that's why Fort Fisher was built so large, to provide covering fire for these blockade runners as they came and went. We can't quantify how many vessels were employed as blockade runners at Wilmington. The records just don't exist. It's going to be like historians trying to document the cartels, the Mexican cartels and the drug trade. You know, you just don't keep a paper trail. So, but from the existing evidence, it appears that there were more than 100 different steamships that operated at Wilmington, to say nothing of the various sailing vessels that were used as blockade runners for the first 2.5 years of the war. Brigs and barks and schooners. But again, based on existing evidence, it appears that the success rate for those ships was about 85%. So tremendously successful trade for the Confederate government, but also investors and speculators in the smuggling trade. Remember how Rhett Butler made his fortune in Gone with the Wind as a blockade runner. And then he got Scarlett O'Hara, and then he did give a damn. So very lucrative business. And that's why the Confederate government invested so much time and energy in building defenses. Other than Charleston, Wilmington was the most heavily fortified Confederate city, except around Petersburg in 1864, and became increasingly important to the point that Robert E. Lee said, if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. So beginning in 64, October 64, probably using enslaved labor. Labor was always an issue in the lower Cape Fear because Whiting always had so many military construction projects ongoing. Not just Fort Fisher, but Fort Anderson in Brunswick County, Fort Holmes on Bald Head Island, batteries on Oak Island to complement Fort Caswell, batteries out on the strand of what is today Carolina Beach, and even up at on Masonboro Island. So there were always military construction projects ongoing that required a lot of laborers. And so on any given day, you would have seen a lot of enslaved and eventually free black laborers working on these projects, working alongside Confederate soldiers. So we don't know the details of the building experience. We can walk the lines back here and just take a quick look at it. They've got the part looking really good, I think. Yeah. Oh, thank you, John. I'm really layered. I've got a T-shirt. I've got a Beatles sweatshirt.
So we came back home.
Thank you. Appreciate your service. And you were stationed out in Colorado?
Yeah, we spent about the last 13 years there out at Fort Carson.
So we're basically at the left end of the works. Take your engagement of Sugar Loaf map and turn it over. Oh, so everyone got a map? Yeah. You see that sketch map? That is the only known wartime map of the Sugar Loaf lines. These things were built beginning in late October of 1864, technically called field works, as opposed to breastworks, which were built for temporary use. Then you've got massive fortifications, permanent fortifications like Fort Fisher, and then you've got field works which were meant for long-term use, and they tended to be larger than breastworks, which is just a line of trenches. So these are field works, and there are places that you'll see today where they're really impressive. They're as nice as anything you would see around, say, Petersburg. So we're on the far left end, and this sketch map I found on the back of a Confederate soldier's letter who was stationed here. And it was on brown lined paper, and after years of surviving, the ink had bled through onto the map. But I could barely make out the sketch map, and he was writing to his mama, Mama, I seat myself with pen in hand to let you know, which is how every Confederate soldier's letter starts, that I am well, and we are at a place called Sugar Loaf. So I was able to get my publisher using software to remove all of the writing, the bleed through, and that's what appeared as that guy's rough sketch map. So the only known wartime view of these lines. And we are on the left where it says Clingman. And it says left. That's how I know we're at the left. So this is where Thomas Clingman's brigade of North Carolinians would have been. Clingman was not here. This brigade, or this brigade was commanded by Colonel William S. Devane of North Carolina. And among those would have been the 8th, the 51st, 61st North Carolina infantry regiments. And then, look where it says Paris Battery. That's Andrew Paris's Staunton Hill, Virginia battery of artillery. And this was one of his positions right here. You can actually see this little line, finger that comes off the back of the earthworks. And there, and this is where like a light piece of artillery would have been. Like a howitzer or a 10-pounder Parrott that were on carriages with wheels that could be pulled by horses and mules and so forth. So that's where a part of Paris's battery would have been. And then the line we'll walk goes to the right, and on the far right is the Cape Fear River and Sugar Loaf Hill. Okay. So the works, they're really keeping good care of the earthworks. They're beautiful. I know that's an oxymoron to call earthworks beautiful, but now after the capture of Fort Fisher, remember the federal forces' objective is the capture of Wilmington. So Admiral Porter, who commanded the task force that captured Fort Fisher, would assemble a flotilla of light draft vessels on the Cape Fear River. So he spends much of late January pushing his vessels across the bar, the shallow bar at New Inlet onto the Cape Fear River. They turn their bows upstream. They are going to eventually move against Wilmington. The flotilla will also protect the wings of the armies, first over here on Federal Point, but eventually when reinforcements arrive in early February, they will be sent into Brunswick County, the mainland on the west side of the Cape Fear River. So the flotilla will provide covering fire for the wings of the armies. And there will be a three-pronged attack against Wilmington. But in the meantime, there are Union reconnaissance forces that move out from their lines that were at Curie Beach. You know where Big Daddy's and Jack Mackerel's are? Yeah. Okay, so starting there, running out toward the Dow Road all the way to the Cape Fear River is where they built their beachhead. And that's where the U.S. colored troops were encamped. And then between there and Fort Fisher is where the capturing Union forces were kind of spread out. And on several occasions, they would send out reconnaissances in force to probe for weak points along the line of the Sugar Loaf defenses. And they could tell how strong these were and how well manned they were too. And I envision a totally different environment. It's wooded now, but in those days, the entire area would have been basically deforested. Now, people use wood for everything, from building to cooking to heating. And the resources were, surrounding them. So the area would have looked totally different than it does now. Colonel William Lamb said, like at Fort Fisher, he said, there was not a place that a quail could have hidden. It was so stripped of vegetation. So when these works were built, for example, to provide a field of fire, the area between or south of the works would have been cut down to at least 600 yards, if the woods were there at all. Now there are places where there still were swampy areas, like this one here. that we call Cook Swamp, and but they were rare. So you could have clearly seen much further south, but that also meant that Union forces could see you fairly well too, including the warships both on the ocean side and the river side. So on a daily basis, the Union warships, to provide covering fire for their troops, but also to harass the Confederates, they would just lob shells into this area and just disrupt the troops. And even at nighttime, you know, 2 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, the Confederates are trying to rest, and then here come these incoming shells that explode around them. So they're just harassing the Confederate troops. And then the Union Army forces would move against the troops and probe for weak points that they might exploit, and checking out the strength of the lines and the disposition of the troops. So they determined these are very strong works. They are very well manned. To attack these things head on in a mass frontal assault, we're going to incur a lot of casualties. So meanwhile, they're waiting for reinforcements to arrive, and they get here in early February. Bill?
How tall were these entrenchments? How high, Chris, originally? About 6 feet?
Not quite that. There are places that they were deeper or taller than others, but basically about chest high. Now, in some cases where the soldiers were more easily targeted, for example, along this front, the Confederate soldiers individually might dig deeper into the ground so that you could not even see their head if they stood looking over the top of the trenches. So they would dig down deeper and then put you'd put headlogs for sure. That would be one way of heightening the earthworks, or digging down deeper and then building what they called a banquet or firing step, where they could step up, fire over the parapet or over the headlog, but then step back down and not be seen. And we'll see that further on down the line. But soldiers who were easily targeted by the gunboats would dig deeper for greater security. What I love about this, and it's got some really nice markers, but what about with this one of my former students was a descendant of James Burris. That's 2 R's and 2 S's. He owned this property. He was a farmer. He owned this property. He leased the Confederate government in early 1861 for Confederate Camp Wyatt. This was the site of the first Camp Wyatt, which was a camp of muster and instruction. It later moved down to about a mile north of Fort Fisher. And then the Confederate government in 1864 used this to build these earthworks as auxiliary defenses to Fort Fisher. My student Kurt Getz was a descendant of James Burris, and he called me at the university one day, or maybe came by my office in the Department of History, and he said, Dr. Fonvielle, I've got a photograph of James Burris I'd like to show you. And it showed James Burris with his sons on this property. And the more I looked at it over the years, I finally saw, and it absolutely floored me. And if you look at this photograph, once you come up here and look, in the background, the photographer was merely capturing the images of James Burris and his sons out in the field. But the photographer unwittingly got the earliest known photograph of these earthworks, about 20 years after the war. I think this photograph was made probably about 1885. It's a tintype, meaning the image is on tin. It shows James Burris and several of other of his sons that my publisher was able to Photoshop out. But if you look in the very back, you can see these earthworks. Now that excites a historian like me, that man, only 20 years after the war, we have got photographic evidence of these earthworks. But from the other side looking north. We're on the north side looking south. We are in the area where the Confederate soldiers would have been deployed, looking south.
I grew up here in Wilmington, and back before we had a lot of respect for our historical artifacts. There were jeep trails over along the river, and we always called those Sugar Loaf.
Yeah.
They weren't Sugar Loaf. What were those big mounds of sand and dunes and all that stuff?
Those were Confederate earthworks that y'all were driving your jeeps over and destroying.
I understand that now. But
Yeah, thanks a lot.
they were part of.
They were part of these works. Right. So we're close to the canal.
Okay.
These actually run further to the east to Sea Watch. I think that's the name of that development on St. Joseph's. Is it Sea Watch? And the Homeowners Association has protected a portion of that line too.
So we went all the way across.
All the way across. All the way across from the canal to the river, to Sugar Loaf. Sugar Loaf Hill was the western terminus of this line, and you can see it on this map right here. And that's where we're going to end up.
So the big water basin over there that goes up to the main dock,
Yeah,
that's always been here. Snow's Cut has not been here. That was not, Snow's Cut, the bridge was not here.
Right.
All that was just like this all the way up.
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just a peninsula and not an island. Yeah. And, you know, it's amazing that these earthworks have survived in such good shape. Yeah.
Incredible.
And,
These type things exist on up into, like,
oh yeah,
in Longleaf Hills and Pine Valley. Back then there was none of that development southeast
right.
to Masonboro Sound. And you would find these all along back in there.
Yeah. In some cases, you'd have to know what you were looking at.
I didn't know what they were, but obviously they weren't natural, you know.
Right. That's right.
Wow.
But in this kind of environment, you know, you could have a natural sand dune or a natural sand hillock, but you'd also have Civil War earthworks. But I'm just one of these Civil War geeks that I'm always looking for earthworks when I'm driving down the road and wandering in the woods. But the sound was fordable. You could have waded across that sound during the Civil War. And on the beach side was Battery Gatlin. And if you look at your map, the engagement of Sugar Loaf, you can see where it says Battery Gatlin or Half Moon Battery.
Yeah.
That was one of the defenses that Colonel Lamb had built, and he could send artillery, light artillery, up to those positions to protect blockade runners that might have accidentally run aground or been run aground by Union ships, and they could still salvage the cargo of military supplies or even civilian goods. So that's why those batteries are built. So on the beach side of these lines is Battery Gatlin, now long gone. And you could actually wade across that Myrtle Grove Sound. In those days, it was actually part of Masonboro Sound. So you see the lines, they run all the way from the sound all the way to the river. And we're in the area where it says Clingman. And then finally on February the 11th, 1865, a month after the fall of Fort Fisher, Union forces would attack this line in an all-out massive frontal assault to try and overrun the works. Just by sheer number, they thought they could overwhelm the Confederate defenses. And the U.S. colored troops would be the principal combatants for the Union side. And those would be the same brigades that would fight, the Battle of Forks Road, which I had written this book about up where the Cameron Art Museum is today. So you'd have the Battle of Sugar Loaf. That was the first battle in the Wilmington Campaign. They failed in their assault, and then withdrew about 800 yards and dug their own line of breastworks, temporary use. And then on a regular basis, there would have been firefighting between the two lines. And skirmishers would go out and engage each other and then retreat back into their main works. But the big push, the Battle of Sugar Loaf, the opening engagement in the Wilmington Campaign, was along this line. And it was on February 11th. And that's why 2 years ago, February the 11th, we dedicated this park, the anniversary of the battle. Any questions, comments, observations, hallucinations?
How long did the battle last? There was just one frontal assault, or?
Well, we don't know, unfortunately. The Wilmington Campaign just did not get as much coverage, in part because by the time the campaign was over, the war was essentially over. And bigger battles like Bentonville were yet to be fought, and they became the focus of the Union general officers' reports about the Wilmington or about the Carolinas campaign, and Wilmington doesn't get as much coverage. So in a lot of cases, we don't know. And all the Confederate records were destroyed in the 1980s. They survived for 125 years, and the Corps of Engineers burned 80 cubic feet of the District of the Cape Fear records.
Really?
Yep.
Just they
Burned them, destroyed them. Yep.
Any particular reason?
The commander made the unilateral decision to destroy them. I was told by an employee of the Corps, and presumably this is on good authority, this guy who worked for the Corps said they were destroyed because of space issues. Yeah.
There was a lot of interest in the Civil War at the time.
Well, apparently this guy said that he implored the commander, the Corps commander of the district, to donate them to the State Archives, to the Cape Fear Museum. He even offered to take them and put them in his garage. And nope, they were destroyed. So 4 years of Confederate history were destroyed in a bonfire that was lit by the U.S. Corps of Engineers.
Wow. There wasn't an awful lot of attention to preservation of battlefields and things like that until probably the big thing was the TV.
The Ken Burns documentary?
Series, in 1990s. And, in Northern Virginia, the Battle of Chantilly, Ox Hill, that totally destroyed. That attracted a lot of attention in Washington, D.C. to lawmakers finally. And yeah, that fits with destroying the records, fits with the way the battlefields were destroyed. And without preservation, like the battlefields, I think, ironically, the role of the U.S. colored troops in the Civil War had been totally forgotten or papered over or lost. But now, remnants of battlefields are left, and historians like Chris, research them, and you find out more about the role of the U.S. colored troops.
Yeah. And in fact, the Cameron Art Museum recently established the first commemorative park to U.S. colored troops in the state. And there is a statue to the U.S. colored troops that fought the Battle of Forks Road, the same troops that fought the Battle of Sugar Loaf, called Boundless, that was done by an African-American artist named Stephen Hayes. And about 15 months ago, they unveiled that. And that's the first figurative sculpture to U.S. colored troops in the state. And
Tom Brady said he was retired too.
yeah. No, I'm not retiring. I'm just moving on to other projects. But
every time those cannons start kicking off.
Yeah.
I live in Pine Valley about 3
Yeah, they make some more noise, don't they?
I love it.
But you know what? We love to hear things go boom.
I love it over there.
That's when I die. I'm going to be cremated. I'm going to be blown out of 3 cannons. Because I ain't going out with a bang. I'm going out with a bang, bang, bang. Actually, a boom, boom, boom. Anybody have any questions?
How far down does the park go?
Oh, just to the tree line.
Tree line.
Yeah, and what the Confederate engineers would do is build these works into the Pecosins or the Carolina Bays and then use them as natural defenses. I can't tell you just exactly where they were. In some cases you can actually see where they might have been, but how much has the ground changed since 1865? At Forks Road, for example, you can see the works go into the Carolina Bay and then they just stop, and then they use the bay as a natural defense because they were impenetrable swamps.
Chris, when they opened the park, did they build those up any like they did at Fort
No,
Jefferson?
no.
This is what
There's
naturally
no
remains.
restoration on these works. So there has been some erosion, but they're still in remarkably good shape.
The picture out there shows them being reinforced with logs and wood and stuff. Would have they been like that, or would they just been?
Yeah, yeah. Because these were field works and they were meant for long-term use, they would have been revetted.
Okay.
So the laborers would have cut pine logs usually and put them up against the back of the works, reinforced by posts, and that would have prevented erosion into the interior of the works.
Like the Petersburg works.
Yeah, exactly, right. Those have long since rotted away. I did find an original one at the Forks Road works, and it lasted a matter of about an hour. I'd taken a picture of it, I ran to get some lunch, and I came back and it was gone. I'd exposed it, I found it, and I'd taken a paintbrush, and, not a paintbrush, but a brush, well, paintbrush. So all sizes of paintbrushes are still paintbrushes, right? Okay, a larger paintbrush. And I completely cleaned it off. Beautiful piece of original heart pine revetment log, and got one photograph of it. This was in 1980. Took off to go grab some lunch. I came back and it was gone. And
The Corps of Engineers got it.
exactly. No, somehow, someway, serendipitously, a guy had seen it from the road and went in with his chainsaw and cut it up for lighter wood. Just like that, it's gone. I did manage to salvage one piece about this long, about that big around.
Is that what you were showing at Cameron Art Museum last year?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Next time you find something, stay with it. Just call us. We'll come and find
And just, what, live there, camp out there?
Oh, we'll come and pick you up. Don't let go of the artifact.
Well, I don't know how much of the rest of the line will be preserved. Some of it is on private property, and eventually they'll probably be destroyed by development. But we have these pieces, and we have those on the state park. And as long as Sunny Point is on the other side of the Cape Fear River, the works in the park will be preserved. But some, as we'll see, the ones on private property, they're magnificent. All right, so let's go do that.